hearing the recording. Great. So I think we can make a start. So welcome everyone to SET's seminar. So we've been running this cycle of seminars, socio-ecological transition seminars, for 3 years now. It seems like not a long, but it's already 3 years. And just going to say a few words on the seminar series before introducing our speaker today. So that seminar is a collaboration between 3 universities and 3 research centers. So the research group on collective action, change and transformation and transition at Trento University in Italy, the Center for Sustainable and Socially Responsible Consumption at Bournemouth University in the UK, and the environmental sociology group at the University of Örebro, Sweden. We've been working on these seminars for some time. We've been really fortunate to have several fantastic international speakers. And for this seminar cycle in spring 2024, we've decided to focus on the public problem of waste and the global sustainability crisis linked to the production and consumption and disposal of commodities mainly. So we're delighted today to have Manisha Anantharaman with us, who will be presenting a book, Recycling Class, The Contradiction of Inclusions in Urban Sustainability. Welcome, Manisha. Just going to give a few words of introduction, if you don't mind, before passing the floor. So Manisha received her PhD from the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management at University of California, Berkeley, and has worked as an associate professor of justice, community and leadership of St. Mary's College of California for 8 years. A few months ago, also very recently, Manisha joined Sciences Po in Paris, where she is an assistant professor at the Center of Sociology of Organizations. And Manisha's research is interdisciplinary and focuses on the interconnection between environmental initiatives and sustainability initiatives and concepts of class, race, and gender. So we're really delighted today to have Manisha to present her recent book with us. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to our speaker. So welcome, Manisha, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me, Roberta, and the other organizations of the Socio-Ecological Transition Seminar Series. I'll go ahead and just share my screen and then, kind of just maybe make some opening comments before I jump into what I'll focus on today, which, as Roberta mentioned, will be my new book that just came out earlier in January. It's with MIT Press, and it's also open access. So if you would like to read it or read parts of it, it's available free to download on the internet, for which I'm very grateful to my publisher for having made that happen. So in preparation for the seminar, I actually had the opportunity to listen to Myra Hurd's excellent talk on her book, Public Sociology of Waste, which she gave the last time you all gathered. And in her book and in her talk, Myra brought attention to how so much of the popular anxiety about waste is misplaced. There is a tendency to focus on municipal solid waste, on recycling, while the bigger sources of waste, so be that industrial processes, mining, the military, as well as the truly transformative actions needed to challenge those core forces of productivism, of neoliberal capitalism, and the systems of disposability it entrenches, are sidelined consistently. And I completely agree with her. And for me, this raises two questions. So first, why do these mythologies persist? And why are they still so pervasive when so many people around the world are concerned about waste in a very kind of immediate lived sense? And from that, the question that comes to me is, what types of collective action can help contest some of these mythologies and these false solutions? Because it's all well and good, I think, for us as academics to develop our critical analysis, and this is essential. But partially, this book was also for me to try and understand where within environmental movements and that are articulating around waste might there be any potential challenges to this facade of disposability. So in the book, I try to look at environmental mobilizations that are articulating around unmanaged municipal solid waste in Bengaluru, India, to explore what type of coalitions forward social justice within sustainability initiatives. And so, in many ways, the book treads quite familiar ground. I'm looking at community action led primarily by women, older people, who try to tackle the waste through zero waste solutions in their neighborhoods and their communities. And these are largely middle class, dominant caste groups. I also look at this issue of unmanaged waste from the perspective of waste pickers and other informal waste workers who make a living reclaiming value from discard. And I try to kind of understand how are their lives and livelihoods being affected by these broader attempts to try and shift and tackle waste in the city. And then I also look at these community processes in relation to national and municipal government policies and schemes that are trying to clean up India as part of kind of a eco-modernization agenda, and also in relation to the ascendance of a global circular economy. A move which is increasingly becoming one of the main ways in which the global environmental spaces and organizations are trying to respond not just to waste, but to a plethora of environmental problems. But by linking all these elements together, I present an account that I hope is unique in its combination of perspectives, but also generative of the types of possibilities that emerge through the friction of these different forces and actors. So before digging into the book in more detail, I will quickly preview one of the main arguments of the book, which I will focus on today. So in the book, what I argue is that households and informal workers, so consumers and informal workers, and I'll tell you who informal workers are in a minute. These are the two groups who are most frequently scapegoated in the blame game of who is producing plastic pollution. When these two constituencies come together in organizing and advocacy, the state and corporations face more pressure and accountability, is what I find. In Bengaluru, a move away from privatization, spectacular infrastructures, and corporate volunteerism toward more public investment in co produced and inclusive infrastructures, as well as pushing for more transformative solution to actually reduce the production of, of waste in the first place, shows us that unlikely coalitions, in some cases, can repoliticize the waste crisis. However, the transformative potential of local sustainability action that brings together diverse social groups is in common cause is constantly threatened by the denial of casteism, a form of kind of oppression, of racialized oppression, as well as the commodifying and co-opting forces of racial capitalism, which threaten to subsume place-based experiments into a corporate green growth agenda. And ultimately, because value accumulation in capitalist economies depends on this expropriation and devaluation of gendered and racialized labor, these logics can infiltrate even well meaning transition policies, reproducing hierarchies within and through ecological transitions. So, and then in the end, I'll argue that, cross-class coalitions that bring together groups in transformative moments are extremely important, but these must also resist the seductions of growth, efficiency, and aesthetics to recover the urban commons from the detritus of a consumerist and casteist society. So this is the book length argument that I'll try to kind of walk you through today through some of the empirical material as well as the theoretical interventions I make in the book. But as you will see, it's a book about the types of collective action that are articulating around the waste crisis in India and the ways in which these could indicate certain possibilities for socio-ecological transitions. So, like my work in general is very interdisciplinary and theoretically promiscuous. I'm interdisciplinary trained, so I feel like I don't always respect the theoretical boundaries that are sometimes set up for us as scholars. So I combine ideas from cultural sociology, urban political ecology, and intersectional feminisms to build my argument around 5 chapters. And so I'll kind of start actually from the work of STS scholars and intersectional feminists who remind us that problem framings determine action. The stories people tell about what drives a socio-environmental issue shapes how they respond to them. So, how ordinary people, citizens, and consumers problematize waste as an environmental problem is situated in partial, a product of their experiences. And indeed, this is why for middle class, upper class, white, dominant caste consumers, race, class, and caste privilege keeps us at the center of urban life, from which waste is discarded onto peripheral sacrifice zones. And we see this, for example, by the ways in which the export of trash is something that is, or scrap, something that's normalized as a global strategy to deal with discards. And I would argue that, to understand these dynamics, we really need to pay attention to the ways in which the logics of coloniality, race, and caste intertwine with capitalism to create infrastructures that hide flows of discards by spatially displacing discards through waste export and dumping, and how these work to severe, hide, and obfuscate the metabolic bonds and relations that connect the few of us who experience, clean spaces and environmental privilege from the many who are subject to environmental injustice. So by coloniality and racial and caste capitalism, I'm referring to the tendency within capitalism and more broadly within the modernity project to exaggerate regional subcultural differences into racial ones. And indeed, while the regional formations of social difference might vary, for example, in South Asia, we talk a lot about caste, which is a form of racialization, a system of oppression that is not only a gradation of labor, but a gradation of laborers. Similarly, race in the Atlantic world, or here in Europe, perhaps more the label of migrant as a banner of racialization. And the intellectual lineages of each of these concepts, such as coloniality, racial capitalism, or anti caste politics, are also distinct and regional themselves. However, in the book, I argue that there's a shared dynamic of one of racialization that produces and naturalizes distinctions between worthy, unworthy, deserving, undeserving, modern, backward, legitimate, not legitimate. And these distinctions are at the very center of the forms of dispossession and expropriation that are at the basis of our systems of production and consumption. And so this denial of racism, casteism, and coloniality enables the willful ignorance of the afterlives of waste. Now, if you add to this also individualizing narratives that bad consumer behavior, littering, and poor disposal infrastructure are the driving causes of the problems with waste, you have a really powerful mythology as to why the city is dirty or why, we have enduring problems with marine plastic pollution, as well as what can be done about it. And indeed, there is a rich body of work in the field of discard studies from the work of scholars such as Max Liboiron, Alice Ma's recent book, as well as older work by Samantha McBride, which demonstrates how these logics are actually actively used and perpetuated by a large coordinated network of big brands and fossil fuel companies who maintain this mythology by promoting piecemeal recycling schemes that kind of try to go around regulation, look to buttress their corporate profits through these systems of discard, and largely follow this green growth agenda. But it's not just corporations, even the way in which we actually problematize waste, whether that's in environmental campaigns and scientific research, often places the onus for fixing the problem onto consumers and municipalities, and kind of like not thinking so much about what happens upstream. And industry promotes recycling also because it's profitable to move the costs of dealing with the disposables onto public agencies, onto consumers, while also giving the impression that disposables are a sustainable form of waste. Now, of course, if we keep digging a bit deeper, we even find that the little recycling that is often that is happening is actually being done by workers and in economies that operate um, outside the wage and outside state protection. And indeed, much recycling work, particularly in the global south, is carried out by informal workers. So these are essentially workers and economies who operate outside of direct regulation by the state, sometimes in conditions that are criminalized. And despite essentially facing a range of barriers in terms of, not having spaces to work, lacking access to full participation in markets, they produce a tremendous amount of economic and environmental value. So, for example, in Dharavi, a settlement outside Mumbai, workers recycle plastic, leather, weave fabric, and produce pottery worth as much as $1 billion a year. And informal workers such as waste pickers and other recyclers, they reduce the cost of public waste management services by diverting recyclables away from landfills. And in the sense, they actually provide a kind of hidden subsidy for both the capital and the state. So what I'm trying to say here is that these systems of disposability are maintained not by spatial displacement, but also by these relationships of expropriation and racialized labor that are built into them, which depend on these systems of kind of sociocultural hierarchies around race, caste, indigeneity, etc. And and this indeed is at the core of what in the book I term a neoliberal sustainability agenda. So the patterns around how waste is dealt with can be understood as a part of a broader hegemonic neoliberal sustainability agenda. This agenda is market friendly. It tries to individualize environmental responsibility. It seeks entrepreneurial solutions on a production side and then self improvement on the consumption side. It enhances private control over public goods and public infrastructure. At the same time, it looks to reduce the role and responsibility of the state. It depoliticizes environmental problems, rendering them largely the domain of kind of technical, managerial, and behavioral interventions. And in the process, it produces environmental injustice by displacing the burden of pollution onto the bodies and the spaces of subordinated communities. And so, as we have growing evidence that this model of sustainability, in addition to being somewhat ineffective, is also unjust, so then this brings us to the question, how do we transition to more just forms of sustainability? So, in recent years, we've seen more and more kind of books and scholarship come out on this topic of just sustainabilities. And one book that I like a lot and I recommend is by Vanessa Castan-Broto and Linda Westman. And in their book about urban sustainability and questions of justice, they assert that to recover sustainability from its neoliberal techno-managerial shackles and to make it a force for social justice, we need collective action that starts from the situated experiences of urban citizens, centers those experiences and the needs of oppressed groups, and cultivates leadership from below. So, in a sense, to actually look at how people themselves are experiencing these changing environments, trying to respond to them. And it is from that space that sustainability can really be recovered from this very top-down managerial system that is primarily serving the interests of capital. But there is a fundamental challenge in this that I try to kind of think about in the book. So, first, collective action is not easy in contexts of high inequality. Gross inequality impedes collective action on environmental issues, both because, as I just said, how people experience, understand, and respond to environmental problems varies based on their social locations. How you see the world depends on your own experiences. And if you're living in a milieu of profound inequality, different people see and experience these changes differently, and therefore they respond to them differently, making it difficult to kind of bring coalitions together across these deeply unequal experiences. But moreover, even beyond this issue of people understanding and experiencing things differently, gross inequality also means that these differential positions indicate different relationships to and perspectives on systems of oppression. So we live in a world where the oppression of some maintains good environments for others. A clean city that is experienced by me is dependent on various forms of labor that are taking place both right here in my city as well as in faraway locations where waste might be shipped off. So what this means is that sustainability projects both shape and are shaped by social locations. So in my work, I take a perspective that this, apologies, I take a perspective that this individualization of the waste issue and the obfuscation of the core drivers of unsustainable forms of consumption and disposal is fundamentally derived from this colonial capitalism's capacity to cheapen both places and peoples in order to maintain the status quo of accumulation through disposability. That it is the fact that inequality serves a function here. It serves a function by which some people and places are available to be global buffers for things that are thrown away. And in turn, I argue that it is in these moments where those very cheapened communities, those communities who are oppressed by our systems of disposability, the moments when they are able to force a repoliticization of the conditions of disposability through their pedagogical activism that demythologizes and defamiliarizes narratives about waste, that we might see some cracks in this facade of disposability. And therefore, one of the kind of main contributions I try to make to the study of socio-ecological transitions is to say that to identify pathways to just transitions, to just sustainabilities, we really need to consider socio-cultural inequalities, racialized social relations, and identity formation as critical elements to look for and to evaluate the emancipatory possibilities of different collective action projects. So studies of socio-ecological transitions really need to pay attention to sociocultural inequalities, racialized social relations, and the ways in which these are not just static, but part of the formation of identities and communities. And this is critical to understand where there is a potential for more just forms of sustainability. So empirically, the book is situated in Asian cities, and Asian cities provide a very important milieu to investigate some of these sociocultural inequalities and racialized social relations that are implicated in socio-ecological transitions. For one, Asian cities have themselves gone through very dramatic socio-ecological transitions in the past 30 years. So the book, which is an ethnography situated in Bengaluru, India. Bengaluru is a city of 10 million people. It's often called India's Silicon Valley because it's where a large number of IT, the information technology industry, is located. It's certainly a critical node in global capitalism, circulating ideas, bodies across the world. And in many ways, its growth story is quite typical of many other Asian cities of its type. In the past 30 years, it's really expanded in size, kind of eating up the more kind of peri-urban rural areas around it, including grazing lands and lakes. And in many cases, that growth has also produced various types of dispossession. And at the same time, production and consumption in particular has really increased in the city of Bengaluru. And, this is perhaps best captured also the ways in which greenhouse gas emissions have grown in India in the past 30 years, but also to note that this when we break down these greenhouse gas emissions on a per capita basis for households, you'll see that there's a tremendous amount of inequality. The carbon footprints of the top 20% of income earners in India who are largely urban, 7 times that of the bottom 40% who are largely rural. So what this means is that, you've seen kind of this tremendous growth, this growth in consumption, but it's been a highly unequal story. Alongside this unequal growth and development, Bengaluru, like many other Asian cities, is also experiencing some of those local environmental externalities of growth. So air pollution, urban heat islands, water scarcity. And perhaps the most visible signs of this are to do with the country's enduring problems with garbage. And plastic consumption and the production of plastic waste has grown exponentially in the past decades. And Bengaluru, in particular, has kind of been in the global news, every 5 years or so saying that the city is drowning in waste. It has burning lakes, and in Bengaluru you really kind of feel that there is no real away for waste. There is no away that it can get sent off to. And while this might be an abstract idea for people in the United States or Europe, where modern infrastructures do a pretty good job at hiding waste, for those of us who lived and grew up in Indian cities, it is real, because waste, the sheer amount and frequency and complexity of it, continuously and constantly escapes efforts to confine and corral it. And so municipal authorities in Bangalore have been struggling to develop infrastructures to deal with these and the environmental problems posed by waste, both by the sheer size and scale of the issue, but also because of neoliberal austerity. So those very neoliberal policies that kind of opened up the Indian economy to foreign direct investment, brought more jobs, more consumer goods, also ended up um, divesting various public enterprises, contractualizing basic, jobs such as sanitation related to sanitation. So this, combined with casteism, has meant that Indian cities have failed to develop the type of modern sanitation and waste collection infrastructures that you see in Europe or the United States. And I argue that these loose infrastructural threads in Bengaluru, as well as the metabolic dependencies that all this unmanaged waste um, creates the conditions for certain types of politics to emerge. So what I do in the book is I look at the overflowing garbage in the city of Bengaluru and the metabolic bonds that articulate around this unmanaged waste as a sort of relational terrain or contact zone that brings a diversity of actors together. And I ask what kinds of everyday practices and political mobilizations emerge around this waste as a relational terrain, and what sorts of possibilities does this hold for socio-ecological transitions? Now, this thinking of waste as a terrain is, of course, something that many other scholars have done. And indeed, as we know from other instances, this type of uncorralled garbage or waste can be democratizing. Garbage can be democratizing. It presents a moral and ethical problem that invites individual and community action to address its proximate causes and impacts. And indeed, in cities across Africa and Asia, waste has played an outsized role in sparking civic activism and environmental mobilization, sometimes even toppling governments and sparking social revolutions. In a more communal vein, civic minded individuals encourage their neighbors to carefully segregate their discards, hoping to reduce the amount of waste that ends up on the roadside and landfills. Well intentioned environmentalists, sorry, all over the world devote themselves to local community based recycling schemes, often women. And on the other hand, as I already described, unclaimed garbage, this garbage that's left around, serves as a type of urban commons, supporting the livelihoods of waste pickers and other actors who make a living by gleaning valuable materials from roadsides and municipal dumps and then supply these to small enterprises where waste is further aggregated and processed, often in artisanal contexts, in order to recover value. So these informal value chains around waste, they provide economic and environmental services, as I mentioned, and they that both by kind of actually providing materials from remanufacturing as well as reducing local environmental burdens. So in kind of looking at this uncollected, unmanaged, unruly waste as a type of relational terrain that connects a diversity of actors, I also looked at how all these actors and their agendas kind of converge and diverge in different moments of time. So I'll start now by talking in a little bit more depth about the middle class zero waste movements that I studied, and what kinds of practices and mobilizations they were engaged in, and then introduce some of the kind of theoretical concepts I developed in the book to try and explain and understand these. So, for over several years, I conducted interviews and participant observations with middle class, high cultural capital groups who were responding to the garbage crisis by taking matters into their own hands and pursuing zero waste behaviors and policies at the neighborhood level. And in many cases, it was like this six-handed woman, in that the people that I was studying were either homemakers, or they were people who had jobs but spent a tremendous quantity of time investing in trying to come up with educational programs, with small scale infrastructures to try and shift the way in which waste was being dealt with in the city of Bengaluru. So, I spent a lot of time hanging out with these communities while they would go, you know, Bengaluru is a pretty spread out city. So sometimes over the weekend, we would travel 50 kilometers in an auto to go to some, new apartment complex. And these women that I was following who saw themselves as kind of passionate zero waste activists would go and make a presentation to, other women saying, hey, this is what you need to do in order to reduce how much plastic you're using. This is what the source of the problem is. You can also become an activist. You can also become somebody who changes how we think about and deal with waste. And so they invested a tremendous amount of time and energy to change behaviors and institute decentralized systems of waste management. And so one of the first kind of concepts I try to develop in the book is the idea of communal sustainability. And I developed this concept drawing on intersectional theories of social reproduction. So, theories of social reproduction, which essentially bring attention to various forms of kind of care work and labor that go into producing the conditions for the production of, of, of capital, the accumulation of capital, the production of that takes place in our economic system. So, social reproduction being sometimes that invisibilized, undervalued forms of labor that take place in the home, in neighborhoods that then kind of enable the city to function, that enable our economies to function. And indeed, I found that these women through the advocacy campaigns they were running, the work they were doing within their home, and this is not just a small number of people. So these were networks that crisscrossed the entire city, and at some point were interacting with as many as 50,000 households that were really trying to shift how the city generally tended to deal with waste. And in general, in Bangalore, the problem of waste was dealt with in this very typical neoliberal playbook of using silver bullet tech fixes, or trying to kind of bring in some private company that would come in and fix something by with some new system, or trying to build waste to energy plants. And instead, these people were trying to chart a collective pathway for socio-material transformation of the waste ecologies of their city. And housewives, retirees, and other unlikely subjects, they enacted a lot of affective and reproductive labor to change not only their own household behaviors, but also the behaviors of their neighbors through a lot of kind of peer to peer advocacy, build small scale infrastructures, and convene collaborative systems of governance. And they came together to create these communities of practice, which deepened then their own capacities to function as political agents for social change. And indeed, this was something I saw that, these people who largely started off working at the very small scale local neighborhood level over time became more empowered and emboldened to actually try and shift how the municipality was dealing with waste by trying to change the rules and laws, push for different types of infrastructural arrangements, and eventually even finding ways to get their ideas to move up to the national level. And in doing so, they really try to challenge some of these core elements of neoliberal sustainability, of pushing for technocratic solutions, very market-based solutions, as well as solutions that are really focused on shifting individual behaviors to instead think about this as a more collective infrastructural project. And since I found that communal sustainability, these formations, built a sense of empowerment and shared identity and a platform for collective action that brought ecological questions back into the realm of the political. And in Bengaluru, these women led movements have been really successful in achieving some large scale transformations of both regulatory processes and municipal infrastructures. However, even within these initiatives, those dynamics of racialization continued to be evident. So, while on the one hand, this form of sustainability opened new avenues for political participation by middle class women and waste workers, both groups who have been historically sidelined in questions of urban politics and governance, it relies on and reproduces long standing class, caste, and gender based divisions of labor. So in many cases, even while these schemes were designed by middle class actors and governed and regulated by middle class women, the actual work of dealing with waste was still done by oppressed caste and working class women who were often in subordinated positions within these schemes. But even but because they were still within these schemes, um, I would argue this was simply not another story of oppression repackaged with a green sheen. And indeed, these metabolic dependencies on labor to enact zero waste systems open new avenues for environmental claims making by certain sections of Bengaluru's urban poor. So while I was following these women around as they were changing their behaviors and convening these neighborhood systems, they were also decided to go to the courts. And when middle class activists filed a public interest litigation in the Bengaluru High Court to try and hold the state government accountable for failing to properly manage waste in the city, they were joined by Parisara Tanda, an organization that represents waste pickers in the city of Bengaluru. So, as I said, waste pickers are individuals and communities who make a living by reclaiming valuable materials from waste. And they, along with waste collectors, middle agents, essentially serve as this informal waste economy that really does most of the recycling work in cities in the global south, not just in cities, but in the global south in general. Since 2011, Parisara Tanda has worked to gain recognition and inclusion for waste pickers in Bengaluru, helping them access social services and economic opportunities. With support from key middle class movement actors and through legal and civic activism, Parisara Tanda has secured new economic opportunities for waste pickers to operate recycling centers and provide waste management services. Moreover, waste pickers are also now seen as experts with invaluable knowledge on how to actually redesign systems of discards. And in a decade, waste pickers in Bengaluru have gone from persona non grata, people to be avoided or expunged, to celebrated environmental heroes. So, in kind of the second theoretical contribution that I try to make with the book, I draw on post colonial theory, particularly the work of Gayatri Spivak, to to talk about this idea of entrepreneurial environmentalism to show how labor becomes a route for marginalized groups to infiltrate sustainability transitions. And this is also because, for me, by and large, informal work and workers have not really been considered seriously in the broader literature on sustainability transitions. While there has been some work looking at the ways in which waste pickers, for example, contribute to recycling at the city level, my question here is, when do they also become leaders who can actually design and govern these systems of discard? And when they do come into those positions, how does that shift what actually happens with waste? And so I found in Bengaluru that these organizations representing informal waste pickers were able to leverage some of the biases of middle class environmentalists. So alongside neoliberal discourses of entrepreneurial valor to make political claims for rights and livelihoods. And I want to say again, the context of casteism is really important to understand why this was a really difficult task to accomplish. Because the way caste operates in Indian society means that waste pickers and other people who work with waste deal with tremendous quantities of daily stigma. They are not seen as doing work. They are not seen as producing any kind of value. And therefore, to try and move from a situation where these people who are, dealing with waste are actually seen as doing something illegal, criminal, something polluting, to then be able to bring attention to the environmental contributions that they are making was a tremendously difficult task. And it was accomplished by drawing on what were already popular ideas in the dominant discourse, such as this idea of, oh, we are the silent environmentalists and robust entrepreneurs. So these environmental narratives, as well as these narratives of entrepreneurialism, connected to neoliberal logics. And indeed, they were able to speak to middle class anxieties because middle class environmentalists did not trust the state because they felt that the state kept failing to clean up the city. They didn't trust large corporations because they felt large corporations were involved in producing the problem. They didn't want large, spectacular technological solutions to the waste problem, like waste to energy plants, because they were afraid of the health impacts of these plants. They really wanted to keep things at the level of the community and through a type of a DIY ethic. And so waste pickers were able to leverage these anxieties and these preferences and convince middle class actors that they were the ones who will, through their labor, deliver clean and green ecologies. And indeed, in Bengaluru, quite interestingly, the coalition between waste pickers and middle class actors was able to successfully lobby the state through the courts to stall the construction of waste to energy plants and other spectacular infrastructure. And indeed, across the global south, these types of waste to energy plants, and specifically the types of technologies that have been used in India, have been associated with a range of environmental health problems. Including, for example, dumping of fly ash, and they've also dispossessed informal workers from their recycling jobs because, and this is a kind of a funny thing, and it also points to how technologies sometimes are not well suited to the contexts in which they're applied. But waste to energy plants do not work very well in India because Indian waste often has a very low calorific value. Has more organic material, so which means the calorific value is lower. So in order to have these waste to energy plants function well, you actually have to keep paper, cardboard within the waste that's going to be burnt. So things that otherwise could be recycled quite a bit. So what this means is these waste to energy plants to waste pickers, they pose a threat because it kind of basically criminalizes recycling because now those recyclables need to go inside the waste to energy plant and get burnt so the plant can work. Then it also poses various threats to the residents living out around these plants through the production of dioxins and fly ash. So, in some sense, it threatens both waste pickers as well as these more middle class communities living next to these plants. And so these groups came together to oppose the proposals to build a plant like this that exists in Delhi and Bangalore and say instead, we are going to combine the civic activism of middle class environmentalists who are going to go door to door and educate people with waste pickers' knowledge of the materiality of waste, of what is recyclable, what is not, what should go where, and to create a more decentralized system of waste management, which is pictured here through this dry waste collection center. And what was also very interesting was while initially these dry waste collection centers were supposed to be, just something that was going to be temporary and did not involve any involvement from the state over time, middle class environmentalists and waste pickers work together to actually pull the state back in and to get the state to actually invest in building out this more decentralized infrastructural arrangement. So in this part of the book, I kind of talk about this idea of infrastructural citizenship. So the ways in which waste pickers, as well as these middle class women, are able to use their capacities to do something materially with waste by creating these infrastructures to then push for solutions beyond the general playbook that the state is coming with, such as building waste to energy plants, and through their participation in this form of DIY infrastructuring, waste pickers gain another platform to make claims. So you can see that, while they use their entrepreneurial capacities to say, hey, we're the ones who can kind of do this work for you and we can do this work for cheap. Once they're inside the system, they leverage their inclusion in infrastructure to engage, to do more materially mediated activism, to gain recognition for the work they're already doing, and to improve work conditions. So, as you can see from this tweet, so initially the state was like, okay, fine, you can have these infrastructures, but we're not going to put any money into them. It's going to be a zero subsidy model. And slowly, waste pickers were like, no, but actually, if you build us a slightly bigger shed, then we will be a little bit faster, and this will actually help tackle the problem. Oh, and you should let us collect the waste door to door, and for this, we would really like some vehicles. So, using their space within. So now that they have been recognized, as producing environmental and economic value, and they're inside the system, using their position within the system to then push for more investment into their own social reproduction. So push for more investment into their own incomes, into their own livelihoods. So and to gain more recognition of the work that they're doing, not just through words, but also through material resources. So this stealth remunicipalization of waste infrastructure is a surprising counter story to the decades of neoliberal divestment that Indian cities have experienced, where the state has largely pulled back from its commitment to support and to contribute to the social reproduction, to the maintenance of infrastructures that support the lives of people and not just flows of capital. The presence of waste pickers within environmental movements, within sustainability movements, also meant that middle class environmentalists learned more about why recycling was not a solution. And indeed, for these posters that show that a lot of the materials that waste pickers were collecting in these dry waste collection centers were actually not recyclable. By demonstrating that the reason why the waste was, continuing to pervade the city was not because workers weren't doing their job. It was not because people weren't collecting waste and separating them, but it was because too much of this stuff simply was not recyclable. By doing the type of data collection to demonstrate this and to educating middle class environmentalists about this, they were able to push back against this kind of scapegoating of workers and consumers that industry is constantly engaged in, to instead hold brands and plastic producers more accountable. So in the book, what I argue that within these communal sustainability initiatives, identification with a common set of goals opens new avenues for collaboration between middle class, primarily women, and waste workers. Building of shared identities and common projects like DIY infrastructures or brand audits can build community assets, sustain cross-class collective action, and even result in shared political demands. So while we often think of recycling programs as, essentially a ruse, a vehicle for corporate greenwashing, in this case, I would say they were also the domain for the expression of infrastructural citizenship and claims making. And this, despite kind of in many ways opening themselves up to new kind of relationships, new circuits of potential exploitation, collaboration with middle class environmentalists gave waste pickers some new access to new arenas for political negotiation. And in the process, this also helped shift the sustainability agenda quite significantly in this local context. However, in the last part of the book, I argue that the transformative potential of this type of local action, which really, where problem, there is a problem that affects different groups in different ways, and there are moments where through the organizing and advocacy of different actors, so the middle class zero waste movement and informal waste workers and organizations, you have a coalition come together that is pushing back against what the dominant status quo ways of dealing with this problem are, and instead pushing for something that addresses both the root drivers of unsustainability as well as brings in questions of social justice and livelihoods more centrally into the transition conversation. However, all of these community processes, these local processes, are taking place in the context of these broader national and international forces. And here, waste is increasingly becoming where capital is going to try and solve most of its problems. So, in India, since 2016, the Indian government has prioritized cleaning up the country, recognizing that garbage stands in the way of aspirations to turn India into a global economic and political power. And so you have a range of national as well as municipal schemes that are trying to not only make waste management more efficient, but also trying to make revenue from waste. To try and kind of make money from waste. Now, at the same time, you also see a situation where global capital is increasingly looking to waste as a mine for resources. And there is a push to transition to kind of the circular economy or circular economies. And this is all about looking for ways to recover value and resources from waste, turning it into the latest commodity frontier for the reproduction of capitalism at a time of ecological crisis. So, in the final part of the book, which is also my current work, I move beyond a focus on urban cleanliness and livelihood struggles to look at how these dynamics of inclusion of waste pickers, as well as middle class environmentalists, are becoming central to how consumer capitalism renews its conditions of possibility at a time of ecological crises, environmental mobilization, and enduring poverty. So today, local struggles over waste and its management are articulating with a global shift or push towards the circular economy. And there are all these schemes proliferating, trying to link global brands with these local informal recycling systems. And I find that by and large, these schemes are trying to find ways to set up market-based mechanisms to promote the recycling of plastics in a way that is least cost to brands and to the state. And part of the way of achieving this least cost aspect is to try and move as much of this work onto waste workers who continue to be held in subordinated roles within these schemes. So I found while these inclusion initiatives might benefit some entrepreneurial waste pickers, these opportunities were actually not available to most actors within the informal waste economy. And instead, what was happening was as the circular economy comes in and tries to essentially, take recycling and supercharge it, it's bringing in all these new actors, such as these startups and these venture capital firms. And all of these actors are saying, okay, yes, we love informal workers. They are really doing a great job. But, we are going to help them become more efficient and we're going to help them do their work better. And we're going to bring all these data driven solutions. So you have a group of smart guys who are engineers or business guys coming from Silicon Valley, getting advice from investors, trying to build a sustainable, scalable business. But so they come in and they promise this win-win-win, that we're going to keep the economy growing, we're going to fix the environmental problem, and we're going to improve the lives of informal workers. But on the ground, I find that because of these existing dynamics of racial and caste capitalism, where waste pickers are reduced to staying in the most subordinated roles within these inclusion schemes, their labor continues to get cheapened. So in the sense that they end up still doing the kind of the most manual, harder jobs within these systems, while you have new actors who are now actually coming in and trying to make money from waste, which in turn puts even more pressure on these actors for whom waste is their source of livelihood. So ultimately, in the book, I conclude by saying that, by bringing together unlikely alliances anchored in material action, communal sustainability serves as a terrain that can produce politics that impedes neoliberal technocratic capture. However, this transformative potential of local action is constantly threatened by the commodifying and co opting forces of global capitalism, which threaten to pull in these place based experiments into a corporate green growth agenda. And this is because of the gendered and racialized labor that is at the basis of how global capitalism deals with its problems. And ultimately, these communal hierarchies and differences along lines of race, caste, and ethnicity undermine collective and communitarian routes to just sustainabilities. So ultimately, we have to think about how sustainability initiatives can be driven by an ethic and practice of reparation, which would redistribute power and resources towards oppressed communities and disentangle socio-ecological sustenance from corporate growth or accumulation goals. And at the core of this, I believe are intersectional coalitions led by those most harmed by the status quo, which remake everyday life, which build infrastructure alongside doing politics, and that being the key to a more transformative sustainability. So I'll stop there, and I apologize. I went a little bit over what I was hoping to say, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Manisha. I'm mesmerized by your presentation. Thank you. It was such a rich portrait of all these social relations that you observed through your field work. Thank you so much. And we have time now for Q&A. So you be free to unmute yourself, or if you prefer to just post your question in the chat. I think everyone is taking a moment to absorb all the information. I know I am. I was making notes and reflecting on everything you were just sharing. I can start with a question if there is no other question at the moment, or maybe people are reflecting. Just on the very last thing that you shared, I feel there is more to unpack there when you mentioned the coalitions that are led by the communities that are most harmed by the exploitation that permeates these relations around waste. So was wondering if you could just unpack that very last point that you made, which it seems that you identify in these type of coalitions the way forward. So I was wondering if there is space in maybe in future research, or if you've observed that already. So yeah, just maybe to unpack that very last point.
And I can talk about that. So I think that that point again comes back from the feminist standpoint theory and STS argument, which is that not if knowledge is situated and partial, then communities who are at the very receiving end of these systems of disposability have a specific outlook and perspective on this. They have knowledge upon how these things work. And waste pickers and people who deal with global discards in particular, given their day-to-day interactions with these materials, know these materials in ways you and I don't. They know about their qualities, their recyclability, the lack of it, what is essential, what is not. And so I think from both an epistemological perspective, this is important, but also from a political perspective, as long as these communities continue to exist and can be held in these positions of subordination, there is always an escape hatch. There is an escape hatch for global capitalism and the way in which it deals with environmental problems, right? Because there is someone it can be dumped on. And so the political power of these communities is also important to close off that escape hatch, to then push for more transformative solutions.
Yes,
I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
yes, absolutely. And this also links very well with the presentation and the reflections we were discussing last time about how scapegoating consumers and proposing individualized and market-based solutions to the problems of waste is exactly just an escape hatch. So, yes, thank you. I think Alice has a question.
Yes, thank you, Manisha. It's been very, very interesting, and so there are so many interesting points brought there that I don't really know where to start. But a question that really kind of moves me from what you were saying, especially at the end of your presentation, about this kind of capture by neoliberal processes of these struggles and these mobilizations. Something that, like, maybe you couldn't go much into, but I'm quite interested in is, where is the political agency there? Because I mean, when you talked about the mobilization of waste pickers, it was quite evident that they had a political consciousness about their positionality. So just wondering, first of all, how much this has kind of traveled towards more kind of middle class forms of mobilization. And the second part is, how does it happen that then these movements can be subsumed in that way? And of course, this is, I understand that this is a question that comes from a kind of privileged position, but and I totally understand that it might be that people kind of need that, but I just I'm just curious of the dynamics of what happened.
No, that's a really great question. And actually, when I first wrote a draft of this book, and I had it workshopped, so somebody read it and they were like, "Oh, but these waste pickers are taking money from Coca-Cola. How can you say that they're like, progressive? They're taking money from Coke." And I was like, "Well, they don't have much of a choice." And this is the real kind of difficulty of the specific political agency enacted by groups who are in this subordinated position within global capitalism, right? Because on the one hand, they are kind of provisioning their livelihoods through accessing waste, and then the minute that the government tries to come in and turn this into a more securitized model of managing waste, privatizing things, enclosing these commons, and says now instead we're going to have extended producer responsibility schemes where everybody is going to have to partner with corporations, and you will do recycling, and then you will sell those credits to the corporation, and then the corporation will say we did our job, we're good. Well, then suddenly this group is now beholden, if they are to continue maintaining a livelihood in this way, to form a partnership with this corporation. And this is exactly what actually they're trying to systematize through things like the Global Plastics Treaty, right? Because all the schemes on this Global Plastic Treaty is all about creating these market-based mechanisms to increase plastic recycling. At least that is one kind of big push from a group of actors. And that will essentially formalize these types of partnerships. And so then the question is, how can political agency remain if people are kind of pushed into partnering with corporations in order to retain their livelihoods? And I think that is still an open question, and one I myself am still trying to think through and struggle with. So thank you for bringing that up.
I think Nicholas his hand raised.
Hello, Manisha. Can you hear me? Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was actually pretty interesting to listen to it again. I listened to your talk at how was it? Open the Bin Free in Lancaster, right?
Opening the bin, yeah.
I don't know if you remember, we met actually in Bangalore quite a few years ago, and I was wondering because I was also back then doing research on the whole garbage crisis, and I really like the arguments that you make, especially regarding what happened since then, because a lot of things happened, especially regarding the circular economy. But I remember back then, while talking to a few specific actors, especially one like Hasi Rodalla, when the first dry waste collection centers came up, basically there was the talk, okay, we are trying to fill this gap now, as you said. So they were trying to actually formalize in one way, get basically one foot into a legalized frame that let them exist and get them space for waste in the city, basically, which is formalized. And the big question mark back then was, okay, there are other actors like Sahas, which are like NGOs that went into actually some kind of green corporate solutions, right? And a lot of other actors. And I was really wondering now, who is running the decentralized dry waste segregation centers in Bangalore now? And was it really possible to include more informalized recycling agents, like reclaimers, waste pickers, into these dry waste segregation centers? Because this was the big question. In this whole process that you frame, I really like the argument, but the question is, how many people who are actually living and working labor with waste are able to be incorporated into the story, and what does it mean in the end, even though I completely agree with all the other arguments. And I found it super striking how this went on afterwards, pushing further, getting more space, super interesting. But I was just wondering, also in terms of because a lot of people depend on it.
Yeah. So I think about the 199 dry waste collection centers that exist in Bangalore, about 65 of them are operated by informal waste pickers. And so it's not all of them, it is 65 of them. And then there are a few more who are operated by groups who employ informal waste pickers, but they are not run by informal waste pickers. So I would say it's about probably somewhere around maybe between 1/3 to a half. And then, of course, there are also informal waste pickers who are involved in providing waste management services in other farms, so more directly to apartment complexes and things like that. However, you're absolutely right. And this is where I think it's important that this is the ability of this system, the waste infrastructure, to provide, employment to everybody who is informally employed is probably it's not going to happen, because that also misreads why you have informal employment in the first place. Informal employment is produced by an economic system that needs to kind of generate and sustain a kind of a type of precariousness uh, because of these waves of dispossession, so it can have a buffer labor pool. And so the conditions of informality are produced by this very system that then, informal workers are now being tried to incorporate it back into, right? So there is a clear tension here between what produces informality, those forces, and those very forces then trying to kind of now include informal workers in order to achieve a set of kind of goals. So I and this is where in the book I differ. My assessment differs from those of, the actual organizations that I studied and worked with, who have spent their time trying to increase the employment opportunities available to informal workers through all these initiatives and ideas. And I actually think that at the end of the day, that may have certain limits, because first of all, there will just be more and more informal workers who keep showing up within this type of a broader economic system. As the city keeps growing and people can't, do grazing livelihoods, can't do agrarian livelihoods. As construction slows down, more people are going to come and work in waste. This is actually a very dynamic population in some ways. And you can't always then find more, recycling work for these folks to do. But rather, it's for me the question of how does the participation of these communities and these actors help push the sustainability agenda beyond, a particular model of seeing what is the set of solutions to the problem of waste, to instead bringing more attention to the conditions of precarity. For example, that thousands of people, millions of people suffer in Indian cities on a day-to-day basis. Because today, actually, in Indian cities, there isn't that much of a conversation about inequality and precarity. To some extent, middle-class actors are much more concerned about the environment than about the fact that, people are in deep suffering due to the conditions of poverty. So for me, it's more the types of things that this puts on the agenda that becomes interesting to track from the perspective of socio-ecological transformations and transitions. It's not so much how many jobs can we create for waste pickers in formalized recycling systems. So that was my non-answer to your answer, to your good question. I see there's a talk. Sorry.
Yes, that is what I was going to say. There is a question in the chat. I'm happy to read it if or Raul, if you'd rather ask it. The question is asking, you mentioned in your book that waste workers across geographies are leveraging environmental sustainability arguments to claim political rights for themselves. And Raul would like to know how difficult it is in smaller cities in India, where ecological sensibilities have not taken significant space within wider political consciousness. So yeah, the question is about ecological legitimacy of waste workers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting and important question. And it certainly So the fact that informal workers have turned to the environment as the terrain to make claims is not by accident. This is because, first, in Indian cities, as I just mentioned, the past kind of 20 to 30 years, geographers like Vinay Gidwani and Partha Chatterjee have kind of talked about this as the post-developmentalist city. So, kind of the city giving up on these commitments to, like, development, to human development, to instead really kind of thinking about urbanism and urbanization as a mechanism to support the flows of capital. So whether that is through real estate capital, through commercial enterprises, right? So the very kind of logic and modes of city making have moved away from thinking about, well, the needs of the poor, providing basic infrastructure. Though in some cases this is still happening, and again, there's always a back and forth every time. Then you get more attention to certain social causes. But waste pickers in particular have not had much success having their right to waste recognized in many Indian cities, and the environment has become an important domain to bring some attention to their labor and their contributions. It's not the only one. For example, in Latin America, waste pickers have largely worked through trade unions and trade union-based organizing to bring attention to and to kind of identify themselves as workers and stake claims as workers. In other contexts, they've used different organizing styles, but so I think the question being, what is the kind of political claims making space that's available? And in smaller Indian cities, I think it's certainly the point that ecological consciousness hasn't taken as much of a hold, means that this type of entrepreneurial environmentalist argument is probably not going to be as persuasive. Though unless, waste pickers and their organizations do the storytelling to explain and actually to build some of that environmental consciousness. And certainly that's something they did manage to do in Bangalore. So where some actors came at the problem of waste solely from a public health perspective or a cleanliness perspective, and then through the activism of waste pickers became more ecological in their understanding of waste as a problem as well. And so that was the piece where I was trying to talk about how waste pickers are also functioning as pedagogical agents, shifting how the problem is understood and framed in the first place.
Thank you, Manisha. I think Magnus has a question.
Yeah, me? Okay. Thank you for an interesting talk. My question is about this zero waste movement, which you talked about to the middle class group. I wonder, are they their critique mostly towards waste as such, or do they also like better treatment of waste, or are they also critiquing the higher volumes of plastic consumption? You showed a slide where there was very dramatic increase of plastic consumption, and if there is any critique.
Yeah, there is. And again, it's kind of gradually changed. So kind of in the very beginning, a lot of these movements were very much focused only on saying, okay, we need segregation of waste at source, we need more recycling. But then over time, both working with waste pickers as well as being in contact with more kind of global movements, there have been kind of demands and efforts to ban certain single-use plastics. So single-use plastics, various types of them are banned in the state of Karnataka. There have been, through these brand audits, there have been campaigns to kind of put pressure on Pepsi and Nestle and Coca-Cola, which are the largest, the brands that are the most represented in the waste that ends up being collected in these waste collection centers. But this agenda still struggles with, I think, the same issues that the global waste agenda struggles with everywhere, which is to figure out, what are the arenas where there's the most effective advocacy that can be done in order to actually tackle the problem of plastic production. And particularly in India, The plastics lobby is quite strong. Petrochemical industries and plastic industries are a pretty large industry, growing industry, employing a lot of people, having, is considered quite important within the local political economies. And therefore, the capacity to kind of for this has this activism now figured out how to target those entities directly? No, they still try to kind of go and try to shift, get the state to ban something and then hope that that ban will reduce production. But that hasn't happened yet.
Thank you, Manisha, for the debate. Just checking the chat, it seems that there are no other questions, so it seems that we can wrap up. Yes, I don't think there are any other questions. So I just wanted to remind before closing the session that we have the last seminar of this cycle at the end of May, 29th of May. Magnus actually will be presenting, so we're very lucky that Magnus has attended today's talk and the previous one as well. So it's going to be like a fantastic closure to this cycle of event. And Magnus will be presenting his recent book, The Social Life of Unsustainable Mass Consumption. So we hope that you can join. And so thank you so much, Manisha, for your
having me.
It was
and for your questions.
The excitement in the topic, and I have so much now to metabolize. So really, thank you so much. And thank you to all our attendees. And yes, I hope to see you all at the end of May.